The United States sells Taiwan billions in weapons, praises its vibrant democracy, even invites its presidents to high-profile meetings. Yet it won't support Taiwan's formal independence. Why? Why would Washington, a champion of self-determination, shy away from endorsing independence for a long-time partner? Well, the answer lies in decades of history. Taiwan, officially the Republic of China, ROC, in its constitution, sits just about 100 miles off mainland China's coast. Its status has been contested ever since the Chinese Civil War. In 1949, China's communists won that war and founded the People's Republic of China, PRC, on the mainland, while the defeated ROC government fled to Taiwan. For decades, both the ROC in Taiwan and the PRC in Beijing claimed to be the sole legitimate government of China, each refusing to recognize the other. The United States initially backed the ROC on Taiwan and even signed a mutual defense treaty in 1954 to protect it from a PRC invasion. During the Cold War, Taiwan was a frontline ally in America's effort to contain communism in Asia. However, by the 1970s, US strategy began to shift. President Richard Nixon's opening to Beijing, part of a broader détente with communist powers, acknowledged the geopolitical reality of the PRC. The first major step was the Shanghai Communique of 1972, in which the US acknowledged China's position that there is only one China and Taiwan is part of China, while stopping short of fully endorsing that claim. Crucially, Washington stated that it does not challenge this one China position and affirmed its interest in a peaceful resolution of the Taiwan question by the Chinese themselves. Fast forward to 1979, a watershed year. On January 1, 1979, the United States switched official diplomatic recognition from Taipei, the ROC government, to Beijing, the PRC. In the second US-China joint communique, often called the Normalization Communique, Washington formally recognized the PRC as the sole legal government of China. In doing so, the US withdrew recognition of Taiwan's government and severed official ties. This was a dramatic diplomatic about-face. Taiwan went from being a treaty ally of the US to having no official US embassy at all. But the story didn't end there. To reassure Taiwan and outline a continuing relationship, the US Congress quickly passed the Taiwan Relations Act, TRA, in April 1979. The TRA, a US law, created a legal basis for an unofficial relationship with Taiwan in the absence of formal diplomatic ties. For example, it established the American Institute in Taiwan, AIT, a quasi-embassy operating as a private non-profit, to handle relations in place of an embassy. The TRA also enshrined key policies. It declared that the future of Taiwan must be determined by peaceful means, and that any attempt to coerce Taiwan would be considered a threat to regional peace and of grave concern to the United States. Moreover, the act made it US policy to provide Taiwan with arms of a defensive character and to maintain the capacity of the United States to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion against Taiwan. In short, even after recognizing Beijing, the US explicitly retained an interest in Taiwan's security and a continued, albeit unofficial, partnership. The delicate balance was further refined in 1982 with the third US-China joint communique. In that communique, dated August 17, 1982, the Reagan administration again acknowledged the PRC's One China principle and agreed that US arms sales to Taiwan would not continually increase and over time would be gradually reduced. This was meant to placate Beijing. However, President Ronald Reagan simultaneously issued 6 assurances to Taiwan to underline that the US was not abandoning Taipei's interests. These secret assurances, revealed later, included pledges that the US had not set a date for ending arms sales to Taiwan, would not consult Beijing on those arms sales, would not mediate between Taiwan and China, and had not changed its position on Taiwan's sovereignty. In other words, Washington reassured Taipei that it would not sell out Taiwan's future, even as it was striking diplomatic deals with Beijing. By the mid-1980s, the framework was set. The United States had recognized the PRC as the sole legal government of China, and thus derecognized Taiwan's government in 1979. Acknowledged but not endorsed Beijing's claim that Taiwan is part of China, starting in 1972 and reaffirmed in later communiques. Committed to a peaceful process for Taiwan's status and continued support for Taiwan's defense under the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act. Maintained only unofficial relations with Taiwan through AIT instead of formal diplomatic ties. Privately assured Taiwan it would not pressure Taipei to negotiate with China or recognize Beijing's sovereignty over the island. This careful, sometimes deliberately vague arrangement is the origin of today's US policy. It sought to preserve stability, deterring communist China from using force, while also discouraging Taiwan's leaders from declaring de jure independence and forcing a crisis. Over time, this approach gained a name: strategic ambiguity. Let's unpack what that means. Imagine being intentionally vague about whether you would defend a friend in a fight, so that no one starts the fight in the first place. That, in essence, is strategic ambiguity in US-Taiwan policy. The United States doesn't explicitly say whether it would militarily defend Taiwan if China attacked, nor does it explicitly support Taiwan declaring independence. This ambiguity is by design. The logic is straightforward: deter both sides from taking reckless action. As one analysis neatly put it, the strategy aims to dissuade Taiwan from declaring formal independence and dissuade the People's Republic of China from using direct force against the island to achieve reunification. By keeping everyone guessing, the US makes Beijing think twice about attacking, since America might intervene, and makes Taipei think twice about proclaiming independence, since America might not intervene. It's a balancing act of uncertainty. All the foundational documents we discussed, the 3 communiques, the Taiwan Relations Act, and Reagan's 6 assurances, together form this overarching policy of strategic ambiguity. Under this policy, the US acknowledges Beijing's One China principle, that Taiwan is part of China, without endorsing it. Washington also insists on a peaceful resolution and continues to sell defensive arms to Taiwan to help it protect itself. At the same time, the US maintains the capacity to intervene if necessary, as mandated by the TRA's call to maintain the capacity to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion against Taiwan. Crucially, the US does not guarantee it will defend Taiwan. Unlike Japan or South Korea, Taiwan does not have a mutual defense treaty with America. Past US administrations have studiously avoided stating clearly what the US would do if war broke out. This uncertainty forces both Beijing and Taipei to keep guessing about US intentions. The theory is that this uncertainty itself serves as a deterrent. China won't invade if there's a chance the US military will show up, and Taiwan won't declare independence if it's unsure the US would back it up. Does this ambiguous stance actually work? Arguably, yes, so far. Strategic ambiguity has helped prevent a major war in the Taiwan Strait for over 40 years. Neither side has been entirely sure of the US reaction to a unilateral move, so both have exercised caution. Beijing has not attempted an outright invasion, and Taipei, even under leaders who favor more Taiwan identity, has stopped short of formal independence declarations. In effect, the US has created a kind of dual deterrence. Beijing doesn't risk war, and Taiwan doesn't rock the boat. One classic example of this dynamic was the 1995 to 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis, when China conducted missile tests near Taiwan to warn its then president, who had been talking about Taiwan's sovereign status. The US responded by dispatching 2 aircraft carrier groups to the area. a potent sign that it might intervene. The crisis subsided without open conflict. The US never said exactly what it would do, but the combination of strong signals and deliberate vagueness kept everyone from going over the brink. Strategic ambiguity, then, is essentially the answer to our big question: why doesn't the US support Taiwan's independence? Because explicitly supporting independence would shatter this delicate balance. It would remove the ambiguity that helps keep the peace. By not supporting independence, and equally by not explicitly ruling out defending Taiwan, the US maintains a status quo that has averted war for decades. There's another angle to consider: the formal commitments and diplomatic understandings that bind US policy. The United States cannot simply declare support for Taiwanese independence without breaking its own agreements and undermining its credibility on the world stage. First, the One China policy. This is the diplomatic cornerstone of US-China relations. Under the One China policy, distinct from Beijing's One China principle, the US acknowledges the Chinese position that Taiwan is part of China, and it recognizes the PRC government as the sole legal government of China. In plainer terms, since 1979, Washington has officially recognized Beijing and does not recognize Taipei as the government of a sovereign country. This was the price of establishing ties with the PRC. If the US were to openly support Taiwan's independence now, it would contradict decades of its own stated policy and likely prompt Beijing to sever relations. Diplomatically, that would be an earthquake. The joint communiques between the US and PRC are explicit on this point. The 1979 communique establishing relations said the US recognizes the government of the PRC as the sole legal government of China, and that within that context, the American people would maintain only cultural and unofficial ties with the people of Taiwan. In other words, no official relations or recognition for Taiwan. These communiques are not just historical footnotes, they remain foundational to US-China ties today. Reneging on them by endorsing Taiwan's statehood would effectively blow up the framework that underpins US-China diplomacy. Moreover, the Taiwan Relations Act itself, while pro-Taiwan in many ways, envisions a peaceful process and does not endorse any particular outcome for Taiwan's political status. In fact, the TRA states it is US policy that the future of Taiwan will be determined by peaceful means. It also declares any non-peaceful effort to determine Taiwan's fate a grave concern to the US. But notably, the TRA does not say the US will recognize an independent Taiwan or the US will defend Taiwan militarily. It carefully leaves those points unsaid, which is consistent with the ambiguity strategy. Some people mistakenly think the TRA is a defense treaty. It is not. It gives Washington flexibility to respond to threats without committing to any specific response. As a US law, the TRA actually constrains American officials from treating Taiwan like a normal country, hence why interactions are conducted via AIT and Taiwanese officials don't get titles like ambassador in Washington. Diplomatically, supporting Taiwan independence would run up against international norms too. The United Nations expelled the Republic of China and seated the People's Republic of China in 1971. UN General Assembly Resolution 2758, effectively affirming the global consensus of One China. Since then, virtually all countries, including all major US allies, have established ties with Beijing and not with Taipei. As of today, only a handful of nations, mostly small states in Latin America, the Caribbean and the Pacific, recognize Taiwan as a sovereign country. In fact, as of early 2024, Taiwan had formal diplomatic relations with just 12 countries worldwide. All others have chosen Beijing. This means if the US suddenly supported or recognized Taiwan's independence, it would be going against the position of not just China, but the entire UN framework and the vast majority of the international community. It would isolate the US on a contentious issue and be seen as a direct challenge to China's core interests, a recipe for a major international crisis. Finally, there's the matter of legal obligations and credibility. The US has a web of agreements with Beijing, the 3 communiques, and while these are not formal treaties ratified by Congress, they carry significant weight. The US also has its own laws, the TRA and others, that govern how it must conduct Taiwan relations. Any shift toward endorsing independence could require new legislation and would certainly provoke legal, diplomatic fallout. American officials, from the president on down, consistently reiterate that US policy has not changed, that it remains committed to the One China policy guided by the communiqué and the TRA. For example, in 2022, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken emphasized, "Our approach has been consistent across decades and administrations. Our One China policy, which is guided by the Taiwan Relations Act, the 3 joint communiques, and the 6 assurances. We oppose any unilateral changes to the status quo from either side." This statement encapsulates how legally and diplomatically entrenched the policy is. Politics and principles aside, let's talk money. Taiwan's status quo is also preserved by enormous economic interests, primarily the US-China economic relationship, and also Taiwan's role in global trade. If the US were to support Taiwan's independence, it would almost certainly upend its economic ties with China, with dire consequences for both economies and the world. Consider that China is one of America's largest trading partners. Trade between the US and China has exploded over the past 2 decades. When China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, US-China trade was significant, but nowhere near today's scale. After China's WTO entry, trade surged. US imports of goods from China jumped from roughly $100 billion in 2001 to over $400 billion by 2023. China is now one of the United States' largest source of imports and a major export market as well. In 2024, for instance, China was America's 3rd largest export destination after Canada and Mexico, with over $143 billion in US exports. The US ran a $295 billion goods trade deficit with China that year, reflecting just how deeply intertwined the 2 economies are. This mutual dependency goes beyond trade in goods. American companies have extensive supply chains in China. Chinese factories assemble everything from iPhones to appliances for US brands. China also holds around $760 billion in US Treasury bonds, making it one of the largest foreign creditors to the US. All of these ties add up to a simple reality. A serious rupture in US-China relations would carry a huge economic cost. If Washington openly backed Taiwanese independence, Beijing could retaliate economically, perhaps by cutting off trade, boycotting American products, or even seizing US firms' operations in China. We've seen a taste of economic friction during the US-China trade war with tariffs, and that already caused disruptions. An open political confrontation over Taiwan could lead to far worse outcomes, potentially plunging the global economy into recession. US policymakers know this. In weighing Taiwan policy, they must consider the impact on American workers, companies, and consumers. Quite bluntly, the US has a lot to lose financially by provoking a full break with China. There's also the flip side. Taiwan's economic importance in its own right, especially in high-tech industries. Taiwan may be small, 23 million people, but it plays an outsized role in the global economy as the center of semiconductor manufacturing. Taiwanese companies like TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, produce the majority of the world's most advanced microchips, the brains in our phones, computers, and even military systems. In 2021, Taiwan held about 64% of global semiconductor foundry market share by revenue, and the semiconductor sector accounted for roughly 15% of Taiwan's entire GDP. This dominance is sometimes dubbed Taiwan's Silicon Shield, under the notion that the world, including China and the US, wouldn't dare let such a vital industry be destroyed. The US certainly is mindful of its reliance on Taiwan's chips. American tech companies depend on Taiwanese foundries to manufacture cutting-edge chips. National security officials worry that, if conflict erupted or China blockaded Taiwan, the US would face a crippling chip shortage. A senior US official even warned that if Taiwan's chip production were cut off, it could cause a deep recession in the United States. These fears helped spur recent US legislation. In August 2022, Congress passed the CHIPS and Science Act, devoting over $50 billion in subsidies to boost semiconductor manufacturing in America. One motivation behind CHIPS was explicitly the concern that the US is too reliant on Taiwan's world-leading semiconductor industry, and that a conflict over Taiwan would have severe economic impacts on the US. Taiwan's own economy is also deeply entwined with both China and the US. China, including Hong Kong, is Taiwan's largest trading partner, accounting for about 30% of Taiwan's exports in recent years. The US is also a major trading partner and the biggest consumer of Taiwan's high-tech goods after China. So the status quo, where Taiwan enjoys de facto autonomy, trades with the whole world, even though it's not universally recognized as a country, and benefits from peace, has yielded prosperity. A sudden move to independence could shatter this equilibrium, leading to military conflict or Chinese sanctions that would hurt Taiwan's economy terribly. That in turn would hurt US and global economic interests. Perhaps the most immediate reason the US doesn't support a Taiwanese declaration of independence can be summed up in one word: war. A formal declaration of independence by Taiwan is widely seen as the tripwire most likely to trigger a Chinese invasion. US officials know that if they encourage or support such a move, they could be catapulting the region into a devastating conflict, one that the US would likely get drawn into. China's government has explicitly codified its hard line on this. In 2005, Beijing passed an anti-secession law aimed squarely at the Taiwan issue. Article 1 of that law states it is intended to oppose and curb the separatist forces of Taiwan independence and promote eventual unification. More alarmingly, Article 8 of the law mandates the use of non-peaceful means if Taiwan formally secedes or if peaceful unification is no longer possible. In plain language, if Taiwan declares itself a separate republic, China has given itself a legal mandate to invade or attack. Chinese officials regularly reiterate this red line. In March 2025, at an event marking 20 years of the anti-secession law, Beijing's representatives doubled down on their stance against Taiwanese independence and even issued new guidelines to punish pro-independence figures, including potentially with the death penalty. For China's Communist Party, preventing Taiwan's permanent separation is a core national priority tied to its own legitimacy. So, consider the situation from Washington's perspective. If Taiwan declared independence, especially with US backing, China would almost certainly respond with force, plunging the US into the most dangerous military crisis in the world. The US has no desire to start World War III over such a declaration. American leaders have repeatedly said they oppose any unilateral change to the status quo, which covers a declaration of independence by Taipei, just as much as a forceful takeover by Beijing. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.